They have an absolute commitment to identify the forces controlling our lives, their weapon and their minds. Their search drove them to extremes, into poverty, into madness. Yet their penetrating, often contentious ways of seeing the world still shape how...
Aha. Here we go. Same BBC. Think they'd compete with themselves? Sure they did.
Over. See, in this wood that would help shape his understanding of how the world works. Peasants taking sticks from the forest floor to use as firewood were being prosecuted for theft. Wood had been gathered here for centuries, but now the landowners had declared it belonged to them. What had been freely shared was now private property. You could say that thinking about this question turned Marx into an economist, but that wouldn't really capture it. He came to think that economics, the nature of economic relationships between people, were at the heart of absolutely everything.
The foundations of Marxist thinking was materialism. That when you cut away religion, ideology, politics, at its root were the material relations between man, the need for food, the need to have a roof over your head. This is what ultimately drives so much of human interaction.
What was unique in Marx, he didn't see economy just as a special sphere. He saw economy as the structuring principle of the entire social totality.
For Marx, it all begins with private property, which divides the world starkly. There are those that have it, and those that don't. Take this wood. Before it became private property, I could do what I like with it. I could heat my house with it. I could make a chair and exchange it for food. But if it belongs to someone else, the whole relationship changes. Now Marx would say, I become a member of the proletariat. Now I have to work for the owner of the wood, the capitalist, for a wage. Then he can sell what I've made for more than he paid me. Look what's happened. Something that was part of my life is now a financial transaction. The capitalist made profit. He can use that to buy more wood, build factories, make more profit, and so it goes on. Profit is now the heart of everything. So there you have it, the Marxian view of capitalism. Or the gist of it anyway. If you want more, you'll have to wade through hundreds of pages of Marx for yourself. The key point for us is that driving force of capitalism, the need to earn more and more profit, well, Marx thought that was also a recipe for constant crises. So Marx would say you could... Now it's a very sophisticated argument, so I'm going to need children's toys to explain it. But let me say right at the start, none of these toys endorse any kind of violent revolution. Now, here's the mine owner, capitalist, miners, with or without hat. Now, imagine that there aren't very many miners around. Then, the mine owner has to compete with the other capitalists for workers. Probably ends up having to pay them more than you'd like to. Trouble is, those high costs cut into the profits. Now, if that's happening across the economy, you've got a declining rate of profit and a lot of capitalists going out of business. You get a crisis. You get countless workers losing their jobs, having a terrible time, until finally wages fall far enough and capitalists can go back to exploiting again. So, high labour costs are bad for business. But what makes the collapse of capitalism
I'm looking
inevitable
for the
Marx
piece on the
is
mine.
that the bosses are in trouble even when they have things their own way. Now imagine the opposite situation. You've got loads of workers, all of this lot competing for a single job. Then, well, no wonder he's smiling. The capitalist only has to pay the workers. the bare minimum. This bucket is what Marx would have called the industrial reserve army of the unemployed. As long as that's full, this lot can keep paying very low wages and keep making profits. Except, in the end, there's a problem. Because badly paid workers don't spend very much, and not very much spending in an economy is not good for business. You get another crisis, more capitalists going bust, and this crisis is going to be harder to fix. So you can see why Marx thought the capitalists were in trouble no matter what they do. They never want to pay the workers more money. They always need to make more profit. But in seeking out profit, they end up eroding the basis on which it's made. They've forgotten, if you like, where their money ultimately comes from. The punchline, as ever with Marx, capitalism is doomed. So that's how problems with wages can cause crises, at least in theory. But how is any of that relevant to right now? A Marxist would say that little parable with the toy net tells you everything you need to know about the financial crisis we've just seen. But they'd say you explain the last 40 years of world history entirely.
There was a little boy or girl who sat on the road in the dark for 12 hours a day.
This is the part I wanted to show you.
It is difficult.
The Industrial Revolution and all the incredible achievements that followed were made possible by coal miners.
This is a replica of what they're like at Victoria era underground. The man you can see at the far side, he had a pick and shovel and he'd work the coal, fill that coal, and then his wife to drag that coal behind it to a loading point, which was up to 30-40 metres away.
I didn't realise that they were their husband and wives, is it?
Oh yeah, the whole families. They need a little boy or a little girl to work this job as well.
So, but if you took the job, you had to sort of provide a small child.
Yeah.
So,
The only light they had between them was a candle which the dad kept, so he could see when he was at coffee. So the little boy or girl was sat on the road in the dark for 12 hours a day.
It is difficult to overstate the horror of industrialisation in Europe. In 1829, Liverpool, for example, the life expectancy of birth was about 28 years. And that was the lowest age since the Black Death. So the impact of the Industrial Revolution on life chances was absolutely terrifying.
By 1849, his revolutionary writings had got Marx banned from everywhere but Britain.
So, both of those videos are very well done and interesting. But I especially found the business of the mine where the father is digging the coal. Notice they can't stand up. He's digging the coal. His wife is the one pulling it out, and the kids are engaged in. His kids are there too. The whole family is in there, and of course it's dark. And in fact, something she says is the only one with a light is the candle that the father has to see where he's. So the others are all in the dark. Can you imagine? Now, she does point out that Marx never had gone into a mine, but he was aware of the situation, and of course, so in a way, these are the people that are lying on the street for him that he feels there's got to be something that society can do to fix this problem. And I don't know that society as a whole, if there's even such a thing when we think of society that way. Is it the capitalists? When we look at our contemporary analysis of this, remember Karl Marx's major work on this is called Das Kapital, or capital, right? Das means just the, but you don't even need the in English because we would just say capital. So if you translate capital, that's how it would come out. But today we have a person named Thomas Piketty, who I would like to point out to you. I don't know if you've ever heard of Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist. Years ago, not that many years ago, he wrote a book called Capital. And the 21st century, this one, the one we're living in. And so, of course, it's basically the same title as Marx's book. And the interesting thing about that is what is all this? Let's just ignore it.
You speak the key, but you must first learn the discipline. Unlock the energy within.
That's capitalism, by the way, in case you haven't noticed it.
Okay, so it's very nice to be here tonight. So I've been working on the history of income and wealth distribution for the past 15 years, and one of the interesting lessons coming from this historical evidence is indeed that in the long run there is a tendency for the rate of return of capital to exceed the economy's growth rate. And this tends to lead to high concentration of wealth, not infinite concentration of wealth, but the higher the gap between R and G, and the higher the level of inequality of wealth towards society tends to converge. So this is the key force that I'm going to talk about today. But let me say right away that this is not the only important force in the dynamics of income and wealth distribution. And there are many other forces that play an important role in the long run dynamics of income and wealth distribution. Also, there is a lot of data that still needs to be collected. So, we know a little bit more today than we used to know, but we still know too little. And, certainly there are many different processes, economic, social, political, that need to be studied more. And so I'm going to focus today on this simple force, but that doesn't mean that other important forces do not exist. So most of the data I'm going to present comes from this database that's available online, the World Top Income Database. So this is the largest existing historical database on inequality, and this comes from the effort of over 30 scholars from several dozen countries. So let me show you a couple of facts coming from this database, and then we'll return to R bigger than G. So fact number one is that there's been a big reversal in the ordering of income inequality between the United States and Europe over the past century. So back in 1900, 1910, income inequality was actually much higher in Europe than in the United States, whereas today it is a lot higher in the United States. So let me be very clear, the main explanation for this is not R bigger than G. It has more to do with changing supply and demand for skill, the race between education and technology, globalization, probably more unequal access to skills in the US, where you have very good, very top universities, but where the bottom part of the educational system is not as good, so very unequal access to skills, and also an unprecedented rise of top managerial compensation of the United States, which is difficult to account a lot just on the basis of education. So there is more going on here, but I'm not going to talk too much about this today because I want to focus on wealth inequality. So let me just show you a very simple indicator about the income inequality part. So this is the share of total income going to the top 10%. So you can see that 1 century ago it was between 45 and 50% in Europe and a little bit above 40% in the US. So there was more inequality in Europe. Then there was a sharp decline during the first half of the 20th century, and in the recent decades, you can see that the US has become more unequal than Europe, and this is the first fact I just talked about. Now, the second fact is more about wealth inequality, and here the central fact is that wealth inequality is always a lot higher than income inequality, and also that wealth inequality, although it has also increased in recent decades, is still less extreme today than what it was a century ago, although the total quantity of wealth relative to income has now recovered from the very large shocks caused by World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So let me show you two graphs illustrating fact number 2 and fact number 3. So first, if you look at the level of wealth inequality, so this is the share of total wealth going to top 10% wealth holders. So you can see the same kind of reversal between the US and Europe that we had before for income inequality. So wealth concentration was higher in Europe than in the US a century ago, and now it is the opposite. But you can also show two things. First, the general level of wealth inequality are always higher than income inequality. So remember, for income inequality, the share going to the top 10% was between 30 and 50% of total income. Whereas for wealth, the share are always between 60 and 90%. Okay, so that's fact number one, and that's very important for what follows. Wealth concentration is always a lot higher than income concentration. Fact number two is that the rise in wealth inequality in recent decades is still not enough to get us back to 1910. So the big difference, today wealth inequality is still very large, with 60-70% of total wealth for the top 10. But the good news is that it's actually better than 1 century ago, where you had 90% in Europe going to the top 10. So today, what you have is what I call the middle 40%, the people who are not in the top 10 and who are not in the bottom 50, and what you can view as the wealth middle class that owns 20 to 30% of total wealth, national wealth, whereas they used to be as poor a century ago when there was basically no wealth middle class. So this is an important change, and it's interesting to see that wealth inequality has not fully recovered to pre-World War I level, although the total quantity of wealth has recovered. Okay, so this is the total value of wealth relative to income, and you can see that in particular in Europe we are almost back to the pre-World War I level. So there's really two different parts of the story here. One has to do with the total quantity of wealth that we accumulate, and there is nothing bad per se, of course, in accumulating a lot of wealth, and in particular if it is more diffused and less concentrated. So what we really want to focus on is the long-run evolution of wealth inequality and what's going to happen in the future. How can we account for the fact that until World War I, wealth inequality was so high and if anything was rising to even higher levels, and how can we think about the future? So let me come to some of the explanation and speculation about the future. Let me first say that probably the best model to explain why wealth is so much more concentrated than income is the dynastic models where individuals have long horizon and accumulate wealth for all sorts of reasons. If people were accumulating wealth only for life cycle reasons, to be able to consume when they are old, then the level of wealth inequality should be more or less in line with the level of income inequality. But it will be very difficult to explain why you have so much more wealth inequality than income inequality with a pure life cycle model. So you need a story